Not to conquer. Erica grinned at the troubadour, clearly enjoying needling her fellow priest. Does calling it liberation rather than freedom make you feel more comfortable? She asked, posing the question with an air of false naivete. Sir Fundin took a long swig from his tankard to give himself some time to think. He had expected the Montanian to be poorly educated in the ways of virtue, and he was rather regretting underestimating the woman. It doesn't matter what we call it, he finally responded. The point is that we wish to liberate and restore those who have been trod underfoot by the Druge, not to conquer them. Oh, I rather think it does matter what you call it, but let's not argue semantics like a pair of Urazeni stargazers considering the heavens. Let's talk about what you actually mean to do. You're here to liberate us, and in truth we're not ungrateful. It's definitely improvement on the last time, no one can deny that. So, when are you going to do that? When will we get liberated? The Montanian priest's voice was light and friendly, her hands spread out in a gesture of open inquiry, but there was a note of steel in her voice that made Sir Fundin nervous. Well, we've defeated the Druge, and everyone is free from their rule now, he responded, unsure of what more he could say. Not everyone, Erica was quick to correct him. The Druge are still terrorising your people in Murderdale and our allies in the heart of Paytat. But let's not argue warfare like a pair of League bravos brawling in a tavern. Let's agree that we're free now. So that means I can preach the tenets of freedom throughout the Barrens, can I? That means my friends in the Great Forest Orcs can return to their home and reclaim the eaves of Paytat, can they? We're all free, so the Black Wind won't have to pay your taxes to your empire. The Ravin will keep living in the Fang and keep the Mithril? Sir Fundin was definitely regretting coming to the tavern this evening. Sir Dindrain would have surely have had the answers to the Montanian's questions, but the questing night was elsewhere, and the young troubadour was suddenly aware of how out of his depth he was. I assume the Imperial Senate will issue a ruling, he finally responded, realising how lame the words sounded even as he said them. Excellent, Erica responded with mocking delight. Let's ignore the question of whether you can really be free if you need somebody else to give you your freedom for a moment. Liberation means the return of our freedom, the right to govern ourselves, not to be subject to the rule of others. So your Senate is going to give us our lands back, are they? We won't be forced to live under Imperial rule? But Imperial citizens are free, Sir Fundin protested. Erica smiled at the troubadour. Our people left the Empire half a century ago, and then we left them. If we had the faintest desire to be Imperial citizens, we could have made that choice at any time in the last 50 years. Do you think the Ravin want to be Imperial citizens, or the Black Wind? We convinced them to make peace with your empire so they could fight the Druge. We made an agreement, then you broke it and sided with the Druge. They hate you even more than they hate the Druge, if such a thing was possible. Do you think they want to become Imperial citizens? She shook her head sadly. Words matter, a great deal. If liberation means anything, it means freedom, and freedom means the right for living beings to choose for themselves. There can be no freedom where our choices are made for us by others. It's not freedom if our only choice is to live by your laws. If you force us to be part of your empire, then you're no better than the Druge. Overview. Barrens has been contested territory between the Druge and Dawn for centuries. The Orcs who live there have been caught in the middle between two powerful nations. They have no love for the Druge, they also have no love for Dawn. Recent events, since the death of Empress Britta, have cemented that dislike, and in some cases, turned it to open hatred. During the conquest of the Barrens, the Dornish armies embraced the words of the Imperial Synod, committing themselves to a campaign of liberation, rather than conquest. They went out of their way to avoid harming the Orcs who call the Barrens home, and focused their attention on removing the yoke of the Druge from their necks. However, the Imperial Military Council chose to focus on supporting the Dornish people in the west, rather than freeing the Ravin, and turned its attention elsewhere rather than bury the hatchet with the Great Forest Orcs. This strategy ultimately led to the Dornish Uprising, with the final conquest of the Barrens. The Imperial Senate assigned the territory to Dawn, a move guaranteed to spark celebration in Astolat, Semaholm and Weirwater, and to outrage the Orcish septs of the Barrens. Last summit, the Dornish National Assembly chose to embrace Sir Dindrain's policy of working with the Orcs rather than flooding the territory with settlers. Those Dornish who had hoped to return to the lands lost when they fled the Barrens and regain their estates in Dawnguard are doing so, but new settlers are holding back while Imperial representatives approach the various factions of the Barrens. The focus is now on appeasing the angered septs and finding ways to create opportunities for the Dornish to help and support the various factions. The endeavour is complicated by the history of Imperial and Dornish relations with the Barons since the winter of 377 YE. The occupants broadly hate, fear, and distrust the Dornish. The perspective of many orcs in the Barons is that the Dornish are indistinguishable from the Druj. Fortunately, in these initial contacts with the Orcish septs, the Dornish have received much-needed aid from the people of Highguard. Using their peerless kinship, highborn priests serve as mediators, speaking to people who do not trust the Dornish. They are also able to parlay their cautious relationships with two of the Barons' factions. The Vendari surrendered to the Highborn, and a number of Great Forest Orcs have worked with the Highborn in Thorunin and Brokeliand in the recent past. Their support has allowed Dornish and the Empire to skip over the first lengthy phase of negotiations, getting the septs to actually talk to them, and has helped to get to the root of the problems. All these negotiations take place under the shadow of the Druj. The thunderous tread of the trees they unleashed still rampages across the territory, while the Towers of Dusk stand ready to protect the Barons from aggressions out of the Malum. There are no armies here. Everyone is on edge, and everyone is aware that a wrong word in the wrong place at the wrong time could cause the entire fragile situation here to collapse. Complexity. This Wind of Fortune has a large number of moving parts, and is probably the most complex wind profound decisions have ever put together. We've kept it as short as possible, but the situation in the Barons is incredibly complex due to the size of territory and the 10-year game history of player interactions with the people who live there. As part of trying to keep it manageable in length, we've cut down the amount of background and scene setting we would normally include. There are 2 pages that provide additional context to this wind. Conflict in the Barons page lays out the political history, both before the game began and after. The situation here is complex in character as well. It contains a number of potential actions, but it is not intended to be definitive. Many of the options here provide merely guidelines about what will happen if they are taken. In particular, if the Empire does multiple things that all change the situation, it's impossible to predict in advance how those things will interact with each other. There's also the potential impact of individual characters on the relationships between the Empire and the Barons' factions to bear in mind, which might further skew things towards the chaotic. For now, though, each of these levers is presented with the best guess of the people involved as to what they will do. One other thing to bear in mind is the Imperial Synod. Its statements of principle and mandates is only of limited use in the Barons. While a judgment can be used to influence Imperial citizens, it is unlikely to move any of the factions. They are simply not open to Imperial priests coming to them with Liao and attempting to tell them what they should do. So while there are mandates here, they are about actions Imperial citizens take, and not about influencing the factions directly by sending missionaries. This is intentional, and proposals for alternative mandates that rely on trying to convert the factions or influence them with auras are unlikely to be accepted. Foreigners and Barbarians. There are several factions in the Barons that are either foreigners or barbarians. The legal status of some factions is unclear. The first complication to be considered in the Barons is the legal status of the various factions within it. The Senate has explicitly recognised the Karass as foreigners, but the situation with the other factions is a little less clear. In winter 379 YE, the Senate declared war on the Barons' orcs that are currently laying siege to an Imperial fort, which included the Ravin, the Blackwind, and the Great Forest Orcs. While they later made peace with the Great Forest Orcs, there seemed little need to alter the situation with regard to the Ravin, as they were all believed to be dead. The Imperial Senate has declared that the Karass are foreigners. It is not entirely clear what the situation with the Vendari is. They are presumably covered by the Winter 379 declaration, but took no part in the actual attack on the fort, and have since surrendered to the Highborn, and, by extension, the Empire. Likewise, the status of the Montanians is also unclear. The Empire historically declared war on the Freedom Heresy forces in 325 YE, and in theory the Montanians are still covered by that declaration. They apparently claim that their grandparents cut ties with the rest of those resident in Montaigne prior to its destruction, but this would not automatically change their status. However, the peace treaty with the Great Forest Orcs explicitly applies to the humans that the Great Forest Orcs recognise as members of their nation. The Great Forest Orcs have said they consider the Montanians active in the Barons to be as much a part of their nation as those who have been living in Thorunin, but this doesn't necessarily have a legal bearing on the status of the faction as a whole. With all of this in mind, the Civil Service have requested 2 administrative motions to be raised on Friday evening at the autumn equinox. Neither of these motions prevents the Senate from changing the status of the faction at a later date, but would clarify the position of the Vendari and the Montanians and their relationships with the Empire. The first administrative motion states that the Winter 379YE declaration of war on the Orcs of the Barrens includes the Vendari. If it passes, then the Vendari are barbarians. If defeated, they are foreigners. The second motion is the provisions of the peace treaty of the Great Forest Orcs that relate to their Briar allies also apply to members of the faction active in the Barrens. If this passes, the Montanian faction will be foreigners and will be assumed to be bound by the same provisions as the members living in Thorunin. If it is defeated, any Montanians not living in Thorunin will be barbarians. Obviously, this motion has implications for relations with the Great Forest Orcs, both those living in Thorunin and Navarre as a whole, and also the Barrens. More generally, the Senate can use a single suitably worded motion to declare war on, or peace with, all of the Barrens factions at once, much as they declared all of the Orcs in Ossium to be foreigners, following the conquest of that territory. If they want to change the legal status of a single faction or a group of factions, that would require a motion for each faction. Liberation, conquest, and negotiation. The Montanians, the Ravin, the Great Forest Orcs, the Vendari, and the Karas believe that liberation means ceding their lands to them. All of the septs are aware that their negotiating position is weak, some more than others. Their demands have been presented in a strict order of things most important to them. The Imperial Synod has repeatedly claimed that they have come to liberate the Barrens, not to conquer them. This has translated into clear strategic costs for the Empire, making it significantly harder for their armies to operate in the territory. But that choice has minimised the casualties amongst the septs who live here, and has been noted by all of them. Most have responded positively to this approach, and while the Empire remains hugely unpopular in the territory, it has created the opportunity for dialogue with most of the septs, which otherwise would not have existed. What it has not done is clarify in legal terms what the Empire actually means by liberation. The point is rapidly approaching where the Empire will have to make it clear to the Barrens what liberation entails, given that none of the occupants of the Barrens have shown any inclination to become Imperial citizens, bar the possible exception of the Karas. The Montanians have eloquently expressed that liberation means nothing less than the right to govern and rule themselves outside of the Empire. They have actively encouraged the other septs to view liberation in these terms, and to demand that the Empire deliver this. The recent decision to assign the Barrens to Dorne, who are deeply unpopular in the Barrens, has not been as well received by anyone other than the Dornish themselves. However, the impact has been mitigated by the timely intervention of the Dornish Assembly, who have encouraged their people not to settle the Barrens until the situation with the septs has been resolved. This has created an opportunity for further dialogue, which has caused most of the septs to state their case to the Dornish and Highborn priests sent to talk with them. This wind presents the extent of their demands, but it is clear that the septs are aware that their negotiation position is weak. Some of them are aware of just how weak their position is than others. Where relevant, the civil service has tried to list their demands in explicit order that are most important to the sept, to support any potential negotiation of a compromise. The first bullet point in the demand is the most important to them in each case. It is genuinely impossible, even for the best imperial prognosticators, to say if there is any common ground is actually possible in each case. Only the heroes at Anvil can determine that. What will categorically not work is trying to persuade the various factions to abandon all their goals. The Empire is in a position to force any resolution they like, but resentment will only grow in any sept that does not win any concessions from the Empire. That will almost inevitably spell trouble down the line. Ravin. Who are the Ravin? The Ravin currently control the Fangs. They are still legally barbarians following the declaration of war in Winter 379YE. They are regarded positively by most other septs other than the Caress and the Black Wind. Communication with the Ravin can be achieved by sending a winged messenger to Yannick, the Fangs, Bitterstrand, the Barrens. The Ravin are now the smallest sept in the Barrens and arguably the weakest. For years it was assumed that they had been exterminated by the Druge. In winter last year, however, it became apparent that the Orcs of the Malum had not been entirely truthful. Survivors, possibly the last members of the sept still alive, were discovered to be enslaved at the Fangs, forced to work in the mithril mine on the shores of the Barren Sea. Supported by the Imperial Orcs of the Winter Sun, the slaves freed themselves and turned on the Druge overseers, slaughtering them and claiming the mine for themselves. At their peak as one sept, the Black Wind and the Ravin were the most powerful septs in the independent barons, and were at the forefront of the attempt to secure independence for the territory. Now the situation is very much reduced, but they still appear to be committed to a vision of a barons not ruled by the Empire, nor the Druge, but the Orcs who live there. What do the Ravin want? They want the Empire to recognise them as foreigners and cede control of Bitterstrand, the Carmine Fields, and Murderdale. They want the Empire to acknowledge its role in the death of Ravin and the slaughter of their sept. They want to reunite their sept with the Black Wind. The Ravin want a free barons that is independent of both Druge and the Empire. The Ravin want to be free, and they are clear that this means freedom from the Empire every bit as much as it means freedom from the Druge. Recent actions by Imperial Orc, Highborn and Dornish armies have made them open to the idea of negotiation with the Empire, but the prospect of a settlement looks remote. The leaders of the Ravin are clear that if the Empire really means to liberate the barons, then it means giving control of territory to the people who lived there. Before the sept split, the Ravin and the Black Wind dwelt in Bitterstrand, the Carmine Fields, Murderdale, and parts of what was once Dawnguard. They want the Imperial Senate to recognise them as foreigners and to cede these regions to them. At present, there are little more than 750 Ravin gathered at the Fangs. Initial rebellious slaves have been joined by Ravin orcs liberated by the Imperial armies from other parts of the territory, especially the Plains of Teeth. They believe that more of their people are likely living as slaves in the salt flats of Sanath and perhaps the forest of Ulnak, but they have no way to reach them. The sept split when the Empire and the Druge made common cause to put down the Barons' Orc rebellion. Those who preferred to go down fighting for their cause kept the name of Ravin. Those who chose to surrender to the Druge became the Black Wind. The Ravin hope to open negotiation with the much more numerous Black Wind sept in the hope of reuniting with their kindred if the situation allows. They anticipate that the Black Wind will share their ambition to gain control of their former lands in the Barrens. For now, they control the Fangs, which they are mining using the primitive equipment left behind by the Druge. They would dearly like to use the precious metal to arm their sept and the other septs of the Barons, to better resist the Druge and Imperial domination. Even armed, the Ravin would be too small to provide a credible military threat, but the same would not be true if they were able to arm the other factions. At present, they lack the means to forge weapons and armour in bulk, and are seeking ways to resolve that shortcoming. Mostly they treat the Fangs as a stronghold, keeping the Empire out. They refuse point blank to leave the Fangs. They have received support from the Winter Sun, and some Imperial Orcs continue to supply them despite their technical status as barbarians. Priests from Dawn and Highguard and members of the Imperial Orcs have all spoken with leaders of the sept. Their assessment is that the Orcs are proud, ambitious and courageous, but wise enough to understand that their best hope at present is to negotiate with the Empire. They will never give up control of the Fangs. They see the Mithril as crucial to ensuring the Barons has the strength to defend itself from future attacks by the Druge and the Empire, but their demands are negotiable. Crucially, they are realistic enough that they don't expect Dawnguard to be handed over to them. Most think of the place as being Dornish anyway. In addition to the land, the Ravin are bitter about the Empire's role in the death of Ravin, the charismatic orc who once united the septs of the Barons against the Druge, and the subsequent war against the Ravin that enabled the Druge to enslave and kill the rest of the sept. If the Empire found a way to acknowledge their role in these events and communicate that to the Ravin, it would improve diplomatic relations and make them less openly hostile. Leaving the Ravin in control of the mine while their attitude to the Dornish and the Empire as a whole is one of hatred is extremely risky. Their sept demonstrated in the past that it was prepared to take on outrageous odds in its ambition to free the Barons from outside control, and there is no doubt that they would do so again once they had armed and armoured themselves. If other Barons' Orcs rallied to them, it is not impossible that they could raise an army, given enough time to do so. Senate opportunities. Ravin. The Empire is formally at war with the Ravin. The Imperial Senate could recognise the Ravin as foreigners. The Senate could cede one or more regions to the Ravin. They want Bitterstrand, the Carmine Fields and Murderdale in that order. The Senate could formally recognise Ravin control of the Fangs. The Senate could issue a statement accepting Dornish or Imperial responsibility for the destruction of the sept. Any one or more of these conditions could be submitted for ratification as a single treaty by the Imperial Senate if signed by the Imperial Consul. The first step towards engaging in diplomacy with the Ravin is likely to be for the Imperial Senate to recognise them as foreigners. The Ravin understand enough about Imperial law to understand how precarious their current position is, while the Empire remains formally at war with them. The Empire declared war on the Ravin in Winter 379 YE. Ending that conflict will provide a stable basis for better negotiations going forwards. The Ravin are adamant that they will not accept Dornish or Imperial suzerainty. They have made it clear that they want control of the Bitterstrand, the Carmine Fields and Murderdale in that order. If the Empire were to cede one or more of these regions, then relations would improve accordingly. At present, they do not trust the Empire enough to send a delegation to Anvil. Last time they came and negotiated in good faith with the Empire at Anvil, it did not augur well for the Ravin. If the Imperial Senate ceded one or more of the regions in the Barrens to their control, it would create enough trust for them to be prepared to send an official delegation to negotiate with Imperial representatives, or to receive such a delegation. Ceding the Bitter Strand would mean giving up the Fangs, a valuable mithril resource currently controlled by the Ravin. Rather than cede the whole region, the Imperial Senate could recognise Ravin control of the mithril mine. This would be less effective at improving relations than ceding the entire region, but frankly there are insufficient Ravin to control the Bitter Strand fully at this time anyway. If this were done, they would still begin arming and armouring themselves, but it would not make the Barrens easier for an outside force to conquer. But if Dornish citizens do begin to settle in the Barrens, they would eventually establish estates in Bitter Strand outside the area controlled by the Ravin that would likely lead to friction between the two groups unless relations had greatly improved by then. Of all of the factions in the Barrens bar the Blackwind, the Ravin are perhaps the most furious with the fact the territory has been given to Dorne. They blame the agreement between the Dornish and the Druge to split the territory between them for the failure of their ambitions. The Highborn grudgingly suggest that a clear statement by the Imperial Senate accepting Dorne's culpability for the destruction of the Ravin and the slaughter and enslavement of their people by the Druge will go some way towards improving their attitude towards the Empire, although it will do little for their dislike of the Dornish. Unless it is supported wholeheartedly by the Dornish National Assembly, it is likely to offend the people of that nation. An alternative would be to downplay Dornish culpability and instead have the Empire as a whole take responsibility for these actions. If that was the approach taken, it would improve Ravin attitudes to the Dornish slightly, but at the cost of making them more suspicious of the Empire as a whole. Given the formal way this set of demands has been presented, it would be legally possible for the Imperial Consul to submit a treaty for ratification by the Imperial Senate that met one or more of these demands with a single Senate motion. Military opportunities. Ravin. The Empire is currently at war with the Ravin. A single Imperial army could attack the Ravin to disperse them in a single season, taking less than 50 casualties in the process. A single Imperial army could besiege the Fangs and starve them out in 2 seasons without loss. While the Synod has called for liberation of the Barrens, the Imperial Military Council could take an altogether different stance. The Ravin are preventing the Empire from claiming the just rewards for their labour, and the Empire is still at war with them. A war started when the Ravin led an attack on Dornish land. There are less than 1,000 Ravin in Bitter Strand. It might not be pleasant, but a single Imperial army could move into the Barrens and defeat them. The general would need to issue an attacking order and make it clear that their intention is to seize the Fangs and drive out the Ravin. The Orcs would likely fight, and it would be necessary to kill their warriors. There is no way that they could stand against an Imperial army, even one depleted by casualties. The Civil Service estimates that the forces involved in attacking the Ravin would take less than 50 casualties, but they would not be able to engage in resupply. The Empire would claim the Fangs, and the involvement of the Ravin in the Barrens would be permanently ended. A less bloody approach could be taken, closing a cordon around the Fangs and starving out the defenders. A single Imperial army could enter the territory, issue a defending order to besiege the Fangs. The general would need to be very clear in their orders that their intention was to starve out the defenders of the Fangs. The Orcs would be unable to hunt, and their supplies would quickly dwindle. Once started, the blockade would need to continue uninterrupted, but it would not require the same army to maintain it. It would take 6 months for the Ravin to run out of supplies to the point they were forced to surrender or accept death by starvation. This would allow the Empire to claim the Fangs without risking Imperial soldiers' lives. It would depend on the response of the Ravin whether they survived as a faction in the Barrens. Either of these approaches would send a message to the other factions of the Barrens that opposing the will of the Empire will be dealt with harshly. This would have both positive and negative impacts on relations, not only with the septs of the Barrens, but potentially some other septs still under the Druge control in the Malm, as news will spread. It would make the septs less likely to want to cooperate with the Empire, but make any resistance or rebellion less likely. If an Imperial army were to move into the Barrens and take a defending order, and the general specified that they were protecting the Ravin, this would make it almost impossible for another Imperial army to either remove them or blockade them. In the case of an opposing Imperial army, Imperial soldiers will not fight without absolutely explicit instructions to do so. Synod opportunities. Ravin. Dornish, Highborn or Imperial Orc Assembly could use a mandate to send relief to the Ravin in the Fangs. The Ravin have freed themselves from slavery, but they are living in wretched conditions. The Imperial Orcs of the Winter Sun have provided basic supplies and continue to support them. but their ability to do so is limited. Now that the Dornish control the territory, they are in the best position to provide significantly more support if they wanted to do so. But the priests of Highguard or the Imperial Orcs could arrange for the help if they wished. Such an action would challenge the Sept's perception of the nation that undertook it. If we are to be liberators, not conquerors, then our pride must be conveyed by action, not by words alone. We send named priest with 75 thrones to provide food and other vital supplies to the Ravin and Bitterstrand. All that is worthwhile is shared with those who deserve it. Synod mandate, Dawn, Imperial Orc, or Highborn National Assembly. If this mandate is enacted, the named priest must ensure the funds are in their inventory after the summit, just as it would be needed to do so with Liao. The priests will gather food and other vital supplies, dried food, fresh water, warm clothes, healing herbs, oil, building materials, and the like, and deliver them to the Ravin. As long as they do not attempt to use this opportunity to convert or influence the Ravin, their largesse will improve the Sept's attitude of that nation. Dornish priests are involved, and the Orcs will be prepared to at least speak with the Dornish emissaries, and will assume a measure of good faith. If the Imperial Orcs are responsible, it would cause the Ravin to become more well disposed to the Imperial Orcs, prepared to speak with them directly and securing their ability to negotiate with the Orcs on behalf of the Empire. Providing these supplies will make it harder to starve the Ravin out, increasing the time to do so by at least 3 months. One thing that will definitely not work at this time is any attempt to convert the Ravin to the virtues. They are on the verge of taking up arms against the Dornish and the Empire. They will utterly reject any attempt to encourage them to embrace the virtues. Priests trying to do so will simply be turned away, or worse, by the Ravin. This act of charity is not necessarily a crime while the Ravin are barbarians, providing it is clearly a mission of mercy rather than an attempt to support them against the Empire. It should not lead to a prosecution, but Imperial magistrates may be able to give more detailed advice. Ravin risks. If the Ravin reunite with the Black Wind, their power will increase significantly. If that happens, it might make it possible to negotiate with the Black Wind. If the Ravin are left in control of the Fangs, they will ultimately supply weapons and armour to every sept in the Barrens. The Ravin were once seen as liberators by the other Barrens Orcs factions. While their situation is catastrophically reduced, the other factions will watch to see how they are treated with interest. If their strength were restored, they would certainly wield a great deal of influence in the Barrens for good or ill. Most notably, the Ravin were keen to reunite with the Black Wind. If they are allowed to do so, it would restore much of their former power and prominence of the Sept, but it would create a basis for negotiations with the rest of the Black Wind. Leaving the Ravin in control of the Fangs would allow them to begin arming and armouring themselves, and eventually the other Septs. They lack the means to forge weapons at the moment, but that situation won't last forever. In the past, the Ravin used the Fangs to arm themselves and the other Septs. It is clear they will do so again if given the opportunity. It would take time, but if the Ravin remain in control of the Fangs, then they could launch an armed rebellion in the future. Right now, that outcome is inevitable. It could only be prevented by improving relations between Dawn and the Ravin, or by seizing the Fangs from them. Karass. Who are the Karass? The Karass are viewed with suspicion and hostility by other Barons factions. A delegation came to Anvil during the summer summit. The Senate has declared the Karass to be foreigners. Communication with the Karass can be achieved by sending a winged messenger to Anchor Karass, the Centipede Stone, the Bleaks, the Barons. The Karass have never had much contact with the Empire. They did not throw their lot in with the Orc Rebellion, maintaining a position as allies of the Druj, rather than risk it all for a worthless cause. They mostly dwell in the Plains of Teeth and the Bleaks. They are believed to be related somehow to the Septs of the Menthratat in Ossium, who apparently enjoyed a similar relationship with the Druj there. There is no doubt that the Karass enjoyed a better relationship with the Druj than any other group in the Barrens. The other factions of the Barrens are universally suspicious of, or even actively hostile to, the Karass. During the summer solstice, a delegate from the Karass came to Anvil and met with Skywise Rokana, Aramis Dufrost, and the Imperial Consul, Yarrick Orzel. Terms were provisionally agreed upon, and the Senate recognised the Karass as foreigners. Shortly after their representative returned from Anvil, there was a meeting in the Bleaks, attended by representatives from most of their settlements. It was followed by a flurry of activity, and reports from the Towers of Dusk say that most of the Karass settlements on the Plains of Teeth now seem to be abandoned, their inhabitants withdrawn to the Bleaks and into the untrod groves. What do the Karass want? The Karass want the Bleaks, the Plains of Teeth, and the Tower of Dusk ceded to them in that order. They want a peace treaty with the Druj. The Karass dwell in the Plains of Teeth and the Bleaks and want control of both of those regions, including control of the Towers of Dusk. These requests were denied when their representative visited Anvil at the recent summit. Instead, they were offered and accepted the status as foreigners. During their meeting with the Empire, their representatives claimed that they were innocent vassals of the Druj, and that they were worried about having a border with the Malum. The regions where they live border two Druj territories, the Sarangrave to the south and the Salt Flats of Sanath. So it is difficult to see how that could possibly happen. However, it appears that the Karass are very concerned about the threat from the Druj, and in particular about the certainty of reprisals by the Druj against any Baron Orc septs that sides with the Empire. Their view is that these risks would be significantly reduced if the Empire agreed a peace treaty with the Druj. While they are certain to break the treaty at some point, agreeing to an end to hostilities would reduce the risk of an imminent invasion and give the Karass cover to cooperate with the Empire. The Karass claim to be happy to serve the Empire, but their actions don't match their words. Despite the Senate declaring them foreigners, they've shown little interest in dealing with the Empire. They've largely withdrawn from the Plains of Teeth into the untrod groves and the Bleaks, where they are not welcoming Imperial visitors. The few Dornish and Highborn priests who are able to speak to some of them send less positive reports. They are described as vigilant and ambitious, but largely disinterested in bowing their heads to the Empire. The Karass seem to have enjoyed a relatively close relationship with the Druj, who granted them a considerable degree of autonomy. Whatever the successes of the negotiations at Anvil, when the delegate returns they claim that the Empire has told them that they will be ruled by the Dornish and offered them nothing. This seems to be broadly in line with what they expected, apart from those who expected the Empire to murder the envoy. They seem to believe they will get much more favourable treatment from the Druj. It seems that if the Empire does want to win the Karass over, they would need to make significant concessions. At present, they seem to believe they have more reasons to favour the Druj than the Empire. The clear risk is that if their loyalty to the Druj is anything more than purely transactional, then they might take whatever the Empire gives them and still side with the Druj when the opportunity arises. If we cannot have the Bleaks, why would we differentiate the Dawn from the Druj? If our only choice is to be part of your empire or be nothing, then we aren't liberated, we're conquered. So why should we accept that? If you liberate someone, you can't make them your subjects. If you force us to pick between conquerors, we would pick the Druj every time, not least because we know that the Dornish and the Empire will always run away in the end. The Druj did not have to conquer Murderdale or the Carmine Fields after all. Anchor Karass. Vendari claims. The Vendari claim the Karass will betray the Empire to the Druj at the first opportunity they get. The Vendari are deeply distrusted by all factions in the Barrens for betraying the rebellion. The Vendari are the immediate neighbours of the Karass and claim to know them best. They allege that the Karass are largely indistinguishable from the Druj, that the Sept are closely allied with the Buruk Tepal and were treated well by them when they ruled the Barrens. Their proof of these claims are the rumours that the Karass control an entire Black Lotus plant. How would that be possible unless the Sept enjoyed the trust and protection of the Druj? The Buruk Tepal take anything of value from their subjects. The only possible reason why they haven't seized a priceless Black Lotus plant is because they enjoy a close relationship with the Druj, so the Vendari claim. According to the Vendari, the Empire should expect the Karass to be every bit as duplicitous as the Druj themselves are. They will claim they will lie and say anything if they think they can gain thereby. According to them, any offers of fealty or loyal service should be treated with the same skepticism that the Empire would treat the words of the Druj. According to the Vendari, if the Karass have accepted their status as foreigners, it is nothing more than a lie. It is difficult to know how true these claims are. The Karass utterly deny the rumours that they own a Black Lotus plant, but they are widely distrusted by the other factions of the Barrens. So little are they trusted they are not invited to join the rebellion against the Druj. Unfortunately, to complicate matters further, the Vendari are not considered much more trustworthy than the Karass. They did join the rebellion when it began, but they turned their coats and switched sides back to the Druj the moment it became clear which way the wind was blowing. Senate opportunities. Karass. The Senate could cede one or more regions to the Karass. They want the Bleaks and the Plains of Teeth in that order. The Senate could open negotiations with the Druj with a view to securing the eastern borders of the Barrens. The Karass have been recognised as foreigners, but the Empire has refused to cede any lands to them. The Karass have claimed to be content to live as citizens of the Empire and vassals of the Dornish, but the Vendari claim this is a tissue of lies, and the Kharas were simply biding their time until the Druj return. At present, the Kharas appear to believe they gain more from Druj controlling the Barrens than the Empire. They have asked for control of the Bleaks and the Plains of Teeth in that order. If the Empire were to cede one or more of these regions, then they might be enough to change the calculation. Ceding the Plains of Teeth would mean giving up the Towers of Dusk, a crucial fortification that guards the eastern borders of the Barrens. The Kharas claim that if the Empire cedes the region to them, they will take over operation of the fortification, saving the Empire the costs of running it. It's clear the Kharas don't expect the Empire to cede the Plains of Teeth, and thus the Towers of Dusk to them, but they seem disappointed not to be granted the Bleaks. However, there may be good reason not to cede any regions to the Sept, if the Vendari prejudice is correct, and the Kharas are allies of the Druj. While ceding the Bleaks would demonstrate the good faith behind the claims the Empire is there to liberate them, and that might improve their attitude, it might also be the same as essentially giving a region back to the Druj. Military opportunities. Kharas. 2 armies could destroy the Kharas before they become established, taking less than 100 casualties each. Declaring the Kharas to be barbarians the season after declaring foreigners would send poor signals to the other septs. If the Kharas have a Black Lotus plant, then it could be captured if they are attacked directly. The Kharas are a large sept. They seem to be reasonably well organised. They've withdrawn from the Plains of Teeth into the Bleaks and the untrod groves. Clearly familiar with the terrain, and the longer they have to dig in and secure their position, the harder they will be to remove. 2 Imperial armies on attacking orders, one dealing with the Bleaks and one with the untrod groves, would be sufficient to break the Kharas. Both armies would likely suffer casualties, beyond those inflicted by thunderous tread of the trees, but it would be no more than 100 apiece. Attacking only one region would weaken the Kharas, not neutralise them. Most would simply flee into the other region. This action would almost certainly be illegal unless the Senate declares war on the Kharas. While there is no legal issue with the Imperial Senate declaring war on the Kharas so soon after declaring them to be foreigners, it would send a very unfortunate message to the other septs of the Barrens. The Kharas are almost universally unpopular. They have no friends or allies in the Barrens anymore. However, no matter how much the other septs may dislike the Kharas, they would still look askance at such a dramatic reversal. If the Imperial Senate can change its mind so quickly, why wouldn't they act the same towards the other septs? This action would negate any short-term diplomatic benefits to be had by declaring one of the other septs to be foreigners. Both regions were attacked by an Imperial army and one of the attacking armies gave orders to conduct a daring raid or to plunder the region, they could seize the sept's Black Lotus plant, if it exists. Of course, this will fail if the septs are telling the truth when they claim they do not possess a plant, but otherwise it should be possible to claim this legendary treasure. The opportunity to deal with the Kharas in this way is only available at the autumn equinox. After that, the Sept will have secured its position in the 2 heavily forested regions, and will require additional effort to remove them should the military council wish to do so. Kharas risks. The Kharas have enjoyed a close relationship with the Druj. If the Empire doesn't convince them to support the Empire, they are certain to side with the Druj in any future conflict in the Barrens. If the Kharas betray the Empire to the Druj, it will allow the Druj armies to more easily seize any regions they control. There are significant risks in any concessions to the Kharas. If the Kharas side with the Druj after they have been given one or more of the regions of the Barrens, then Druj armies could cross into the Barrens without needing to claim a beachhead first. Even worse, if the Kharas had control of the Towers of Dusk, then the Druj could claim them without a fight. However, if the Empire doesn't make any attempt to win the loyalty of the Kharas, it may be just as risky. The Kharas don't have any army at present, but they are securing their position in the Bleaks and the untrod groves. They are armed with superior knowledge of the forest than the Empire, or any of the other septs for that matter. They are also clearly disciplined, as their abandonment of the Plains of Teeth suggest. They could prove a serious thorn in the side of the Empire for some time to come, especially if they were received arms or other support from the Druj. Vendari. Who are the Vendari? The Vendari are viewed as treacherous and untrustworthy by the other factions of the Barrens. Their major complaint with the Empire is that the acts of Imperial spring magic that destroyed their homes when the Barrens was flooded. Their legal status is unclear at present. Communication with the Vendari is possible by sending a winged messenger, Gal Huana, Pyroclast of the Vendari, the Palace of Fire, Saltmarsh, the Barrens. The Vendari are a secretive sept of orcs who dwell in Saltmarsh. They were known to have a relationship with the Druj that allowed them a modicum of independence and self-rule, and as a result are widely distrusted by the other factions, who consider them to be self-serving and treacherous. They prefer to describe themselves as practical rather than treacherous. They have had little in the way of any effective fighting force, claimed to be powerful magicians, and are known to be skilled scouts and spies. They took part in the rebellion when the barons rose up against the Druge, but joined late, and switched sides once it was clear the uprising would fail. The Ravin hold them in particular contempt for this decision. On the other hand, they have the least reason to distrust or dislike the Empire. When Saltmarsh was conquered by Imperial forces, they surrendered en masse to the Highborn. Currently, they are still dealing with the aftermath of the magical storms that battered the Bitter Sea, raised by Imperial magicians. The Bitter Sea has inundated Saltmarsh, causing extensive flooding and destroying many of their settlements and washing away the dams and levees they used to make the area habitable. They were most welcoming of the Highborn, and they seemed to have the least dislike for the Dornish. Indeed, if not for the rumours they have heard that it was a Dornish archmage that sent the Bitter Sea flooding into their homes, they might even be neutral to the new rulers of the Barons. What do the Vendari want? The Vendari are willing to leave the Barons if they are granted permission to live elsewhere. They would like the Empire to cede either the morass in Holberg or Rebeshoff in Holberg, or the Saltmarsh in the Barons, to them. They would need an escort from the Barons into Holberg due to the dangers of the journey. Unlike the other septs of the Barons, the Vendari are open to the possibility of leaving the territory and settling elsewhere. Their home, the Saltmarsh, has been wrecked. The floods of salt water have destroyed much of their agriculture, and many of the swamp animals have either died or gone elsewhere. Almost everything they have was destroyed with the spring magic the Empire raised in the Barons to flood the Saltmarsh. Worse, the Saltmarsh is the easiest route from the Barons into the wider Malum, which means they are very, very afraid of both a Druge counterstrike into the Barons and the possibility their former masters will decide to make an example of them when they return. They are convinced that any sept that cooperates with the Empire will face terrible punishment once the Druge return to the Barons in the force. None of them want to end up on spikes as a warning to other septs not to deal with the Empire. Like the other septs, they still want a region ceded to their control. The difference is they would prefer that region to not be in the Barons. After all, their neighbours would hardly be sad to see them go. The Vendari are aware of the mostly unsettled marshes in Holberg and consider that they would be perfect for them, especially the morass. When queried as to how they know about the morass, they shift awkwardly and suggest their guests change the subject. It's sufficient to know they are making an informed choice about the matter. They'd also like an escort. Barons is dangerous not only because there are other septs that would see them come to harm, but because the Druge are still in control of parts of the territory, so they would need an escort. Unwilling neighbours. The Sandfishers have made it clear they would prefer not to share a territory with the Vendari. The Vendari are unwilling to live in Ossium while the Menthrotat reside there. The League National Assembly has made several statements about welcoming orcs. Indeed, they have just welcomed several thousand Apulian orcs as actual citizens. It is not impossible that they would welcome the Vendari, especially as they seem to be only interested in stinking marshlands. Unfortunately, there is a fly in the ointment. As soon as they get wind of the proposal, the Sandfishers of Miserycord send a small delegation to Miserycord Market to make it clear they have severe reservations about sharing territory with the Vendari. Their reputation for self-serving treachery is not unknown to the orcs of Ossium, and the Sandfishers warn that they cannot and should not be trusted. Allowing the Vendari to settle in Holberg will certainly sour the Sandfishers at least a little on their neighbours in the League, and may lead to further conflict. Discussion of Ossium raises another possibility which the Highborn discuss with the Vendari. The priests of Highguard have recently been active in Ossium themselves, and some of them sound the Vendari out about another possibility, the marshes of the Drownbark Forest. They are initially interested, but when they learn the Menthrotat sept still occupies part of that territory, their tune immediately changes. Regretfully, they argue their situation would be little better in Ossium. The Druge of the nearby forest of Ornak would still be a threat, so Drownbark Forest is definitely out of the question. Senate opportunities. Vendari. The Senate could cede one or more region to the Vendari. They would like the Morass or Rebeshoff, or Saltmarsh in that order. If a region in Holberg is ceded to them, they want protection to escort them as they reach the area safely. The Vendari would like the Empire to cede them a region so they can live there and govern themselves. They would prefer the Morass in Holberg or Rebeshoff if that is an option instead. If they must remain in the Barons, they would like the Saltmarsh ceded to them. If the Senate cedes either the Morass or Rebeshoff in Holberg to the Vendari, they will begin making preparations to move there. The Senate could arrange a payment of 75 thrones from the Imperial Treasury to secure mercenaries and sellswords prepared to escort the sept to their new homes, and they would not actually be able to take control of the region until this were done. This would significantly improve the Vendari attitude to the Empire. Once they are established, they would likely wish to trade with their neighbours and explore their new status alongside the Sandfishers and the League. Doing this will lead directly to friction with the Sandfishers, who regard the Vendari with considerable trepidation. After some further discussion, the Dornish and Highborn negotiators are of the opinion that ceding a region of Holberg is not the only option here. The Vendari don't actually want to leave the salt marsh, they just feel that they are in immediate danger from both the Druj and their neighbours, and they know they will struggle to thrive in the region in its current ruined state. If the region were habitable and safe from the Druj, they would be delighted by the prospect of living there, if the region was ceded to them. While they have requested the morass, as time goes on, they will become increasingly prepared to settle for almost anywhere that is not close to the Druj. There have been more than one slightly regretful mention that they'd be happy to live with the Highborn if they had any actual marshes. It might be possible to negotiate a different settlement for the Vendari. The Vendari are not especially ambitious or courageous, although they do seem to be wise. While they are currently asking for a region of the Empire to be ceded to them, they seem the least assertive of any of the factions in the Barrens. Some priests who have spoken with them seem to think they are more aware of the weakness of their negotiating position than the other septs. Others think the Vendari are just more pragmatic and less inclined to believe imperial claims that they have been liberated. If they were ceded a region that was safe from reprisals by the Druj, they would become very positively inclined to support the Empire. If not, it might be possible to negotiate an arrangement similar to that the Great Forest Orcs have in Thorunin, residents in an imperial territory, as foreign guests, without giving them complete control of the territory. Military opportunities. Vendari. The Vendari could be destroyed as a faction by a single Imperial army taking less than 100 casualties. An Imperial army could protect the Vendari, improving their attitude to the Empire. The Senate did not cede a region to the Vendari, the Sept could be escorted to their new home by an Imperial army. The Vendari would be the first to admit that they are not soldiers. A single Imperial army, on attacking orders in the Barrens, whose general made it clear they were driving the Vendari out, could shatter the faction entirely. Some of the survivors might flee to the Malum, but the faction would cease to be a factor in the Barrens. It is clear that the Vendari's greatest concern is the threat of Druj reprisal. Should they collaborate with the Empire in any way, an Imperial army in the Barrens could take defensive orders and specify that they are protecting Saltmarsh and the Vendari. This would ensure that the Druj could not retaliate against the Sept unless they succeeded in retaking the region first, but this is only a short-term solution at best. Vendari attitudes to whichever nation the army represented would be significantly improved during this time, however. Finally, if the Senate does not cede a region to the Vendari, an Imperial army could escort them to a new home. The army would need to start in the territory, take a defending order, and specify in their orders that they are escorting the Vendari. They would then need to move to the target territory. This can only be done if the Vendari have agreed to the journey. Doing this would prevent the Senate having to spend any money. Conclave opportunities. Vendari. The Conclave could provide an endowment of 120 crystal mana to the Vendari magicians to use to mend their homes. The Conclave could use an endowment to provide the Vendari with a stipend of 50 crystal mana a season to cast Dripping Echoes of the Fen. Conclave could send a single Conclave order to investigate the Saltmarsh and see how they can help. Some of the witches and magisters talking to the Vendari are of the opinion that the Orcs don't want to leave the Saltmarsh. It is their home, and has been for hundreds of years. It's just that the territory is wrecked. During the summer solstice, Dornish magicians invoked Regrow the Heart's land on the Barrens, and that has gone a long way towards repairing the damage caused by the tumultuous storms. Unfortunately, it isn't enough by itself to deal with all of the problems the Vendari are currently encountering. Their homes have been smashed by floodwaters, vital animals and plants killed, and the waters have still not receded as the dams they used to protect key areas were destroyed. The Vendari are by all accounts magicians themselves, however. An initial assessment suggests they are adepts of night magic and competent spring magicians. An endowment of 120 mana from the Imperial Conclave directly to the Vendari would provide them with what they need to restore the Saltmarsh themselves over the coming months. The other thing that troubles the Vendari, that the Druj will seek to retaliate against them, might be addressed in a similar manner. The Vendari have covens amongst them that are capable of performing Dripping Echoes of the Fen, but their mana sites have suffered from the floods alongside everything else. The Conclave could agree to endow them with 50 mana each season for the next year, specifically to raise their own defences around the Saltmarsh. The Vendari would do that without a second thought. A single declaration of endowment would be enough to create a stipend for the next year. In theory, Imperial magicians could simply cast the ritual on Saltmarsh, but that would only help if the region was ceded to the Vendari. Otherwise, the magic of the ritual would work against the Orcs, making life even more difficult for them to live there. Either or both endowments would significantly endear the Vendari to the Imperial Conclave, and to whichever nation the magician who raised the declaration was from. Another possibility would be to dispatch a Conclave order to Saltmarsh to support the Vendari, or to find ways that the Conclave could offer greater assistance. Any order might volunteer, but only a single order can undertake this mission. The nature of the order would influence what opportunities they would discover. Of course, some critics point out that if the Conclave does get involved, it will simply encourage the Vendari to stay in the Saltmarshes. In this case, they are almost certainly going to petition for the region to be ceded to them, but of all the septs in the Barrens, they are the one that might be persuaded to accept Dornish rule. On the other hand, there are some suggestions that the Vendari are in contact with the Eternal they call the Shimmering Fish. The Prince of 1,000 Foes has been quiet of late, but some magicians see the signs of his influence in the Vendari proposals. After all, his creed is very clear on how to deal with conquerors. If you cannot hide, run. If you cannot run, yield. If you will not yield, kill. Right now, it seems the Vendari are preparing to run, but if forced to the edge, they may decide they need to kill to survive. Vendari risks. The pragmatic Vendari are unpopular with the other septs, a reputation that extends as far as the Sandfishers in Holberg and the Orcs that live in Ossium. Any perception of favourable treatment of the Vendari may cause a negative reaction from the other septs. The Vendari have already demonstrated that they will switch sides to support the Druj if their lives depend on it. The Vendari are notorious for their pragmatism. Their reputation extends beyond the Barons, and they are unpopular with the Sandfishers and some of the inhabitants of Ossium as well. They are seen as treacherous and self-serving. Any attempt to find them a new home elsewhere in the Empire is likely to lead to problems as a result. However, there are problems if they remain in the Barons as well. They are not popular with the other septs that took part in the rebellion against the Druj. The Vendari joined the rebellion late and soon switched side once it became clear that victory was in doubt. That treachery left a bad taste in the mouths of those septs that fought on to the bitter end. The Vendari are currently the most amenable of any of the Barons' factions to Dornish rule, and they also seem to be the most open to negotiation. However, there is some risk that if they reach a satisfactory resolution with the Empire that allows them to prosper, it may cause rancour and bitterness with the other septs. That may make negotiations with other septs more difficult. The biggest single risk is that the Vendari betray the Empire at some point in the future. They openly speak of being pragmatic, which is the Vendari way to describe the decision to abandon the rebellion and side with the Druj. If the Vendari were in a similar situation in future, they would do the same again. If the Druj move into the Barons in force, and they look set to take the territory, then Vendari will switch sides if it benefits them. The Great Forest Orcs. Who are the Great Forest Orcs? The Great Forest Orcs are foreigners and guests of the Navarre. Most of them live in Thorunin. A number of the members of their sept are still held as slaves of the Druj. Communication with the Great Forest Orcs is possible by sending a winged messenger to Chief Valak, Great Forest Encampment, Lower Tarn Valley, Thorunin. The Great Forest Orcs claim the Forest of Paytat is the remnant of the Great Forest that once covered most of the Empire and the Malum. Many of them fled the Barons when the Druj finally conquered the territory, and now live in Thorunin as guests of the Navari. There are still Great Forest Orcs dwelling in the territory, however, mostly as slaves in the heart of Paytat, which remains under Druj control. These two factors make them one of the weaker factions in the territory, at least at the moment. Imperial relationships with the Great Forest Orcs have slowly improved over time, not least because members of the Sept are regularly seen travelling the Trods alongside Navari stridings. They remain deeply distrustful of the Dornish, however. An offer last summit to participate in a ceremony of reconciliation was declined by the military council, and so relations with the new rulers of the Barons continue to be poor. They are also one of the easiest factions for the Highborn Wayfarers and Grey Pilgrims to approach. There have been an increasing amount of cooperation between the Highborn and the Great Forest Orcs in Peak Edge Striding, and in Alariel, where a shared interest in healing and herbs has helped to secure cordial relations. What do the Great Forest Orcs want? The Great Forest Orcs want to control the heart of Paytat and the eaves of Paytat. The Senate expressed the intention to cede the region and the Weirwood Grove to them, but they remain under Druj control. They are willing to fight the Druj directly to reclaim their homes. The Great Forest Orcs of Thorunin watch developments in the Barons with interest, yet they are somewhat confused. When they first settled in Thorunin, they disbanded what remained of their army, putting aside their spears to focus on hunting and securing homes. Yet they made it clear that all their hosts had to do was call, and they would send warriors to support the Navarre armies in a campaign to drive the Druj out of the Barons. While their aid was solicited to fight in Brecheliand against the heirs of Turiniel, or to help in the grand adventure into the heart of the Valorn, the call to fight the Druj never came. Over a year ago, the Senate reassured the Orcs of the Great Forest that they intend to return Paytat and the Weirwood Grove there to them, so that they could return to their ancestral home. Yet with most of the Barons liberated, the heart of Paytat remains in Druj hands, and it seems in short term that the Empire may be content to leave it that way as they strike against the salt flats of Sanath. They know that members of their sept still live there in the region, and are in terrible danger. A Druj scheme to slaughter many of the septs still in Paytat was thankfully stymied by the Navarre, under the guidance of Travid Longestpath. Yet there was nothing to stop the Druge making another attempt to slaughter all of the Great Forest Orc slaves they have currently working at the Weirwood Grove. Synod opportunities. Great Forest Orcs. The Highguard Assembly could ask the Highborn to partner with the Great Forest Orcs to enable them to retake Paytat. The mandate would be in competition with any other mandate attempting to name another peerless kingship partner. The mandate would improve relations between the Orcs and the Highborn, but impact relations between the Orcs and the Navarre. The Great Forest Orcs have become increasingly impatient by the failure of Navarre to call them to fight alongside them to retake the heart of Paytat. They are bemused by the Navarre decision to disavow engagements with the Druge, and frustrated by their lack of opportunities to take the fight to their enemy. After discussion with Highborn priests, Chief Valak has made a proposal. The kernel of their army still exists, and with sufficient support they believe they could deal with the remaining Druge and liberate the people themselves, just as the Dornish did with Dawnguard. The home of the Great Forest Orcs is still in the hands of the Druge, and their people are in terrible danger. We send named priest with 50 doses of Liao to urge Highborn to aid them in their endeavour, offering whatever help is needed to drive the Druge from Paytat. Do not fear to act, only be shamed by inaction. Synod mandate, Highborn National Assembly. If this mandate is enacted, then following the autumn equinox, the Great Forest Orcs will rally their remaining warriors and hunters and launch an attack against the Druge in the heart of Paytat. With the aid of the Highborn, they will be able to defeat the Druge, claiming the region and the Weirwood Grove for themselves, meaning the Senate would not need to cede anything. The region would belong to the Great Forest Orc Sept. The Great Forest Orcs will certainly be grateful to the Highborn, although what form this gratitude might take is impossible to say. However, this aid will come at a price. The Highborn will need to focus their attention on helping the Orcs at the cost of aiding one of their Imperial siblings, meaning they will be unable to choose an Imperial nation to support with peerless kinship this season. As such, this mandate is in competition with any mandate attempting to name an Imperial nation in this manner. Highborn aid to retake Paytat would be greatly appreciated by the Great Forest Orcs, and it would significantly improve relations between the Sept and the Highguard. However, after a long wait, it would be clear indication that Navarre simply do not intend to fight side by side with the Great Forest Orcs against the Druge. As a result, the majority would leave Thurunin to return to their former home in Paytat, and the closeness that has existed between the two groups would fade. They wouldn't be angry with the Navarre, but it would be clear that the benefits of their alliance had run their course, and it was time for the Great Forest Orcs to make new allies and new friends. Herminius of the House of the Wanderer has offered an alternative mandate using the Partner of Greatness power to the Urizen National Assembly. Clytemnestra of the House of the Wanderer once said, "With our increased responsibilities come increased obligation to virtue. Urizen, we drove the Druge from our land, yet others still remain under the yoke of fear. We must not abandon them. The home of the Great Forest Orcs is still in the hands of the Druge, their people remain in danger. We cannot let this stand. We send named priest with 50 doses of Liao to urge the Citadel Guard to drive the Druge from Paytat once and for all." Synod mandate, Urizen National Assembly. If this mandate is enacted, then it will demonstrate the support for the Citadel Guard in claiming the heart of Paytat. The army would receive a bonus of 1/10 towards attacking into that region in the season following the autumn equinox, but a penalty of 1/10 if they did anything else. The Citadel Guard wouldn't be able to take the region on behalf of the Great Forest Orcs, so the Imperial Senate would need to cede it, assuming that it was the wish of the Senate. The Great Forest Orcs could be expected to join the Citadel Guard in claiming the region, providing they were informed. Maximilian and Carrion has offered an alternative mandate using the Partner of Greatness power to the Urizen National Assembly. Urizen knows what it is to lose a home and for assurances of aid to go unfulfilled. We send named priest with 50 doses of Liao to call on the nation and the Great Forest Orcs and drive the Druge from Paytat as they were driven from Zenith. Synod mandate, National Assembly. If this mandate was enacted, then it would encourage individuals in Urizen to journey to the Barrens in support of the Great Forest Orcs. It would not be sufficient in itself to aid the Sept in claiming the region. The mandate would see the people of Urizen become invested in the Barrens. Alternative mandate, Great Forest Orcs. Under normal circumstances, it is not possible for the Navarre National Assembly to submit an alternative mandate in the Barrens. Given their close relationship with the Great Forest Orcs, however, and the recent statement of principle of Nathair Autumngale, a member of the Navarre Assembly could do so here. The alternative mandate would need to relate to the plan to seize the heart of Paytat and seek to inspire the Navarre nation. Military opportunities, the Great Forest Orcs. Imperial armies could drive the Druge out of the heart of Paytat. The Great Forest Orcs will contribute 1,000 force to any Imperial army attacking the heart of Paytat or Murderdale, if requested. The Imperial Council could simply assign one or more armies to invade the heart of Patat and kill the Druge there, claiming the region and the Weirwood Grove in the process. The Orcs of the Great Forest would welcome such a move, and Chief Valak has committed his people to aiding any such attack, regardless of whether it is undertaken by the Navarre or not. As long as it is an Imperial army and the General clearly invokes the Spears of the Pine, the Great Forest Orcs will commit 1,000 force to any attempt to crush the Druge in the heart of Patat, and will help to claim Murderdale if the campaign is successful. The Great Forest Orcs despise the Druge, and with the heart of Patat liberated, negotiations with Chief Valak might well secure the support of Spears of the Pines for future military campaigns into the Barrens. Of course, that assumes that the Imperial Senate intends to keep faith with the Great Forest Orcs and cede the heart of Patat and the valuable Weirwood Grove that grows there to them. Great Forest Orc risks. The longer the Druge remain in control of the heart of Patat, the greater the chance that they butcher the enslaved members of the Sept who live there. If that happens, the Great Forest Orcs will question why their home is the only region in the Barrens not to be retaken, and why the Navarre have played no role in the fight against the Druge. The Great Forest Orcs believe the Imperial Senate has promised the heart of Patat to them, and will become discontent and openly rebellious if the region is not ceded to their control. At present, the Great Forest Orcs are prepared to trust Imperial strategy in their campaign to retake the Barrens, but the longer the heart of Patat remains in Druge hands, the greater the chance that the Druge butcher the inhabitants. They could easily kill hundreds of Great Forest Orcs, who are currently toiling as slaves to cut down weirwood for the Druge. If that happens, the Great Forest Orcs will view the calamity as a failure of Imperial strategy, and will question why their home is the only region left in Druge hands. They will also ask pointed questions of their hosts, who they have noted have played no part in the campaign to drive the Druge from the Barrens. It will go badly if they feel the Empire has betrayed them and left their kinsfolk to die at the hands of the Druge. Equally, it will go badly if the Empire captures the heart of Patat, but does not cede the region to the Great Forest Orcs. They believe that the Imperial Senate has promised their home to be returned to them. They will see it as a stark betrayal of trust if that does not happen. At present, they are one of the few factions in the Barrens who don't regard the Empire as inherently untrustworthy. Obviously, their trust would be shattered if the Empire tries to hang on to the region and its precious weirwood resource, but it will be strained the longer the Empire delays in retaking the forests and freeing those members of the Sept who are still enslaved by the Druge. Montanians. Who are the Montanians? The Montanians are heretics who embrace the teachings of the malign spiritual presence of anarchy. The majority were living in Thurunin, but many are now returning to the Barrens. The briars that came with the Great Forest Orcs to Thurunin have mostly returned to Hope's Rest. Their status as foreigners or barbarians is under discussion. Communications with the Montanians is possible by sending a winged messenger to Alan of Dowerfell, Great Forest Encampment, Lower Tarn Valley, Thurunin. Unlike the other Baron Septs, the Montanians are humans, and as far as is known, they all have the Briar lineage. They are descendants of the anarchy heretics who took part in the Freedom Heresy, although they claim their grandparents cut ties with the inhabitants of Montaigne over ideological issues. They once lived in Dowerfell Keep in Hope's Rest, before the majority of them left the Barrens along with their allies the Great Forest Orcs, destroying their home in the process as part of a powerful spring ritual that apparently killed all of the Druge in the process of trying to capture it. They were a key element of the Barrens' Orc Rebellion that began in 377 YE, serving as messengers and mediators who helped spread Ravin's message to the Great Forest Orcs, the Vendari, and the other Septs. They are believed to have enjoyed the assistance of the Eternal Irahara, with whom they are known to have good relations. Since being in the Empire, they have kept themselves to themselves, carefully avoiding preaching their heresy, although they have offered sporadic assistance to Imperial efforts to free people from the yoke of the Druge. Most of the Montanians have been living in Thurunin alongside the Great Forest allies, but many are now returning to their former lands in the Barrens at Hope's Rest. Never numerous, there is nonetheless a growing force there as the returnees joining with those who never left the Barrens. The situation is further complicated by the recent controversial decision to provide them with Liao from the Garden of Glory. Unlike the Orcs, they are entirely capable of performing Liao ceremonies. What do the Montanians want? The Montanians want the Empire to cede Hope's Rest to them. They want to see the Druge destroyed. They want to sign the Liberty Pact. Contact with the Montanians is complicated by the fact they are unapologetic followers of the malign spiritual presence of anarchy, which they call freedom or liberty. However, there is some potential for common ground. Unlike many heretics, they don't deny the seven virtues, and have apparently had cordial discussions with highborn citizens before, although they won't discuss who those people are for fear of getting them in trouble. There is also the recent incident in the Barrens in which a force of Highborn under the guidance of Axa, the general of the valiant Pegasus, prevented the Druze from transforming one of their people into an unliving horror. That they were forced to kill the prisoner is a source of sorrow, but nowhere near as much as if they'd had their souls enslaved by their mortal enemies. With the Great Forest Orcs as mediators, a meeting in the Lower Tarn Valley is organised between some Highborn and Dornish and some of the Montanians. Discussions are complicated by the fact they seem averse to the idea of anyone being in charge, and questions of what they want are often derailed into discussions as the Briars try to reach a consensus among themselves before being able to answer the question. Their ambition, and they clearly state it in those terms, is for the Barons to be free. Specifically for the septs of the Barons, among whose number they count themselves, to be recognised by the Empire as free people, allowing to govern themselves without interference from the Imperials or the Druze. They are wryly aware of how challenging that ambition is going to be to achieve. They seem genuinely to want the Empire to cede all regions of the Barons back to the Orc septs, leaving the territory as a patchwork between disconnected septs. Oddly perhaps, they don't expect the Dornish to give up Dawnguard. It is the home of the people who live there, as one of them puts it. But rather than ruling the Barons, they imagine a future in which the Dornish are only one voice in equal power to the septs. For the Montanians, that would mean the Empire ceding Hope's Rest to them. They are more content to allow Dornish to travel and move through the area, but they are clear for them liberation means having a place where they can live and practice their beliefs without fear of persecution. They would be content to live in Hope's Rest under Imperial rule if the Empire formally embraced freedom as one of the virtues, or if it abrogated all laws restricting religious freedom. But, since they have no expectation of that actually happening, they suggest the only reasonable compromise is for the Empire to cede their former home to them. Even more ambitious, they want to see the Druze destroyed as a power and the entire Malum liberated, but on the same basis. Return to the people who live there, not to be made vassals of the Empire. It is the recent drive to liberate the Barons that has attracted their attention and made them more amenable to talking to Imperial citizens. They're interested to see if the Empire is capable of following through on its promises. They are also very interested in the Liberty Pact. They've heard of it from the Navarre, amongst others, and with the recent decision that any nation is welcome to join, they are interested in applying for membership. While they are small in number, they state their case clearly that nobody is more committed to the cause of freedom than them. They don't understand how they joined the pact, but they would like the Empire to provide them with the names and locations where they might send winged messengers to state their case. Senate opportunities. Montanians. The status of Montanians is unclear. The Senate could declare them to be foreigners or barbarians. The Senate could cede the region of Hope's Rest to the Montanians. You say you have liberated the Barons, but right now it looks an awful lot like you have in fact conquered the Barons. If you're here as liberators, freeing us all from the tyranny of the Druze so we can live our own lives, then we will help that dream to thrive in any way we can if you let us. But if you have come here as conquerors using the words of freedom to mask your intentions, then we will fight you if we have to. And so you had best destroy us quickly. It's going to be interesting to see which way you go. Alan of Dowerfell. The current legal status of the Montanians is unclear. Most people view them as foreigners. They have been living peacefully in Thorunin and walking the trods in recent years without issue. However, there is an argument that they are covered by the Imperial Senate's declaration of war on the Barons' Orcs. They're not Orcs, but they were clearly part of the alliance the Empire declared war on. The Civil Service are planning to introduce an administrative motion to allow the Senate to clarify whether the Empire considers itself to be at war with the Montanians. The Montanians have asked the Empire to cede the region of Hope's Rest to them. They especially want the ruins of Dowerfell Keep and the area around it, perhaps a quarter of the rugged region. That area would include the powerful spiritual aura that hangs over the ruins, apparently created when the Briars unleashed their magic to destroy the castle, the attacking Druze, and many of their own people. They are more than happy to sign a treaty guaranteeing the Dornish the right to travel freely through the region, although they warn the Empire that the reason they want their land back is so they can practice their beliefs and preach them openly to people who visit. While the castle there is in ruins, and they don't seem to have the means to rebuild it, cautious voices have pointed out that they are allied with the Great Forest Orcs. The Orcs of Paytat are masters of the use of weirwood, and they have used it in the past to create a fortification in Thorunin. If they regained the heart of Paytat and the weirwood grove there, they may well be able to help their Briar allies rebuild Dowerfell Keep, giving the Montanians a fortification in the Barrens that was not under Imperial control. Military opportunities. Montanians. There is an opportunity to move decisively against the Montanians who are gathered in Hope's Rest. A single Imperial army could attack the Montanians to eliminate them in a single season, taking less than 50 casualties in the process. The Montanians are known to be gathering at the ruins of Dowerfell Keep in Hope's Rest. Following the autumn equinox, they have invited a number of their allies from other parts of the Barrens and perhaps beyond to meet them there to discuss what happens next. It is clear they intend to use this meeting to try to encourage the Septs of the Barrens to unite around a common goal of a free Barrens. A single Imperial army could issue an attacking order in the Barrens with clear orders to attack the ruins of Dowerfell and wipe out the heretics gathering there. They would annihilate this faction completely and take fewer than 50 casualties in the attack. It wouldn't necessarily be pleasant, and if they were foreigners, it would be a serious crime, but it would permanently remove the Montanians as a factor in the Barrens and everywhere else. Doing this would please the Cuirass, who are known to dislike the Montanians, but it would outrage every other Barrens factions bar the Black Wind. It would, however, send a clear message that the Empire is not to be trifled with. While it would be possible for someone to get a warning to the Montanians before the noose closed around them, the Sept are highly distrustful of the Empire. It is unlikely they would believe a winged messenger that did not come from someone they have already established a close relationship from, or one of the cardinals of the Synod. Synod opportunities. Montanians. The Imperial Synod could declare the Montanians to be heretics. Sending priests to proselytize the Imperial faith to Montanians in Hope's Rest will cause their views on freedom to spread. The Montanians are unabashed heretics and blasphemers. They deny the doctrine of the Seven and the doctrine of human destiny, and openly embrace the malign spiritual presence of anarchy. Some believe that they should be denounced in the Synod and be declared heretics. Others point out that there isn't much difference between the Montanians and the Faradin in the great scheme of things, and at least the Montanians recognise all 7 virtues, rather than denying vigilance, ambition and wisdom. The Synod itself has repeatedly urged citizens to free slaves and to fight slavers. The Montanians applaud these moves, and they have played a major part in the Sept's decision to speak to Imperial citizens. Although priests have raised statements of principle denying that liberated slaves have anything to do with the malign spiritual presence of anarchy, on a number of occasions major military operations to free slaves have been marked by the appearance of spontaneous auras, some of which appear to be linked to freedom. Where there is no evidence of any kind to support the claim, some priests have suggested that these auras may be linked to the Montanians, either directly caused by them, or simply a consequence of permitting them to live freely in the Empire. There are no mandates related to Montanians for the Synod to consider, but statements of principle that achieve a greater majority might cause such mandates to arise. However, the civil service warned that the Montanians have a deep well of ideological commitment, every bit as earnest as the Highborn. Thus far they have held back from preaching their beliefs out of respect for the Empire's laws, and to ensure their Great Forest Orc allies do not suffer the persecution as a result. But they do not view Hope's Rest as a legitimate part of the Empire. Any attempt to send priests to Hope's Rest to proselytize the way will result in more converts among the priests who undertake the journey than the Montanians themselves. Montanian risks. The Montanians will continue to push for the entire Barrens to be free from Imperial rule. They will ultimately call on the rebellion against the Empire if their demands are not met. They will try to spread their religious beliefs to any Imperial citizen who enters Hope's Rest. The Montanians represent a clear threat to the Empire's rule in the Barrens. They are ideologically committed to freedom. They make no secret of the fact that they want the entire Barrens to be free of the Empire and the Druge, and they plan to dedicate themselves to that cause. They are the only Sept in the Barrens whose avowed goals includes the return of lands other than their own. If they are permitted to gather in their strength in Hope's Rest, they will use their position there to encourage the Septs to unite in pursuit of their own goals. At present, they are hopeful that negotiation and dialogue will yield results. They are hopeful that the Synod's message of liberation will translate into concrete action by the Imperial Senate to free the Barrens on their terms. However, they do not deny that they will ultimately attempt to use force to get what they want if diplomacy fails. There is no significant military force in the Barrens at present, nothing that is remotely capable of resisting Imperial rule. But that situation could slowly change if the Raven maintain control of the Fangs and the Great Forest Orcs seize the heart of Paytat. The Barrens Orcs raised the armies against the Druge. The Montanians will encourage them to do so again if their demands are not met. Although they are more than happy to live alongside Dornish people in Dawnguard, they will happily... So tired of this! Although they are more than happy to live alongside the Dornish people in Dawnguard, and happy to welcome them to pass through Hope's Rest, they are clear that their self-imposed restriction on openly practicing and proselytizing their faith does not apply to the Barrens. They are clear that they will attempt to spread their beliefs on freedom to all occupants of the Barrens, given the opportunity. The Black Wind. Who are the Black Wind? The Black Wind are former members of the Ravin who split from the Sept to join the Druge. They live in Dawnguard, Murderdale, Carmine Fields, and the Bitter Strand. They hate everybody, including the Druge. The only people they hate more than the Druge are the Empire. Ravin was a powerful Orc leader who united the disparate Orc septs and helped lay the groundwork for the uprising against the Druge. He claimed they would be a black wind that would sweep the Druge from the Barrens. As the Orcs flocked to his banner, some took up the rallying cry as their new name, the Black Wind. At their height, the Black Wind were able to muster the equivalent of 2 Imperial armies, making them most effective military forces in the Barrens. When the Imperial Druge Alliance agreed to split the Barrens, the impact fell most heavily on the Black Wind. For a while they fought on, but with the Empire and the Druge both attacking them at the same time, the outcome was utterly inevitable. Facing certain defeat at the hands of the Druge and the Empire, the Sept split. The leaders of the Black Wind surrendered to the Druge, believing it was the only possible way to preserve their people. The Ravin stayed true to their beliefs and were wiped out by the Druge. The Black Wind army joined the Druge, the Ravin army was broken, and then the Buruk Tepel ordered the execution or enslavement of every single Ravin Orc in the Barrens. Now, only the Black Wind remain living in those regions. They are a powerful military force, a martial people with thousands of experienced soldiers who form the basis of one of the Druge armies. They hate the Druge with a burning passion. The only people they hate more than the Druge are the Empire. The Black Wind absolutely blame the Empire for forcing them to side with and fight for the Druge. The Black Wind are merciless in battle against the Empire, taking any opportunity to kill as many Imperials as possible. Currently, the Black Wind army is in the Malams somewhere, presumably resupplying. The Black Wind Sept, however, remains in the Barrens, composed primarily of young people, elders, and those unwilling or unable to serve as soldiers of the Druge. At the moment, the majority of them are still in the Carmine Fields, Murderdale, Bitter Strand, and with a handful of small settlements in Dawnguard. Blackwind Orcs served under Sarah Grubfest, the hated Druge governor of the Barrens, and were involved in many of her more brutal reprisals against the Dornish. What do the Blackwind want? They want to see every vestige of the Empire in the Barrens destroyed. They want the Barrens free of the Empire and the Druge. Of all the septs in the Barrens, the Blackwind are the only ones who will not treat with Imperial negotiators. They hide or flee and refuse to speak when cornered. It is possible that the Karass might be able to treat with them, but they have shown no interest in doing so. The Ravin are keen to reconcile with the Blackwind, but there is no evidence that the Blackwind is open to that. They used to deal with the Montanians, but it is clear that they no longer do so either. Both the Ravin and the Montanians are seen as fools for ever trusting the Empire in the first place. The Blackwind desire vengeance against the Empire and most especially the Dornish. They would like to see all Dornish inhabitants of Dawnguard enslaved or executed. If their desire for revenge was sated, then they would presumably inform Imperial interlocutors that they wish to control Dawnguard, Murderdale, Bitterstrand, and the Carmine Field, which is where their people live. According to the other septs, what the Blackwind want is the destruction of the Empire for its role in destroying their people, despoiling the Barrens, and leaving them with no choice but to fight for their hated enemies, the Druge. Ideally, they would like to see the Empire entirely destroyed, although they don't have any concept of how that might be achieved beyond the fantasies of the Druge and the Empire wiping each other out. Their overriding goal, however, is to see a Barrens free of both Imperial and Druge influence. Blackwind are reluctant servants of the Druge. They fight for them only because the alternative was worse. If they had their way, they would want a Barrens free of the Empire and the Druge. Sadly, fighting for that freedom is what got them to where they are now. Military opportunities. The Blackwind. The Iron Helms could execute the leaders of the Blackwind Sept to force the Blackwind army to surrender to the Empire. If the Empire can maintain a consistent threat of destruction against the Blackwind Sept, they could force the army to fight for the Empire. 5 Imperial armies could force the Blackwind Sept to flee the Barrens. The Blackwind in the Barrens are primarily non-combatants. Their soldiers fight for the Druge, but they are not actually Druge. They are cruel, but fueled by anger and hatred rather than malice. They still feel a strong connection, a love for, their people, their spouses, children, parents, siblings in the Barrens. The reason they are fighting for the Druge is to preserve the lives of the people they love. They bent the knee to the Druge to save their people from enslavement, or worse, the fate the Ravin suffered. This presents an opportunity, a horrible opportunity, chanced to deliver a decisive blow to the Druge nonetheless. The Iron Helms are known and feared by both the Druge and by the Septs they rule. They are masters of using that fear to get what they want, to demoralise their enemies. The Iron Helms move to the Barrens and undertake a merciless assault with clear orders to execute key members of the Black Wind, and the army will certainly hear of it. Presented with an ultimatum, the Black Wind will have to either betray the Druge and surrender to the Empire, or stand by as everyone they care about is killed. There is no doubt among the other Septs that the Black Wind will surrender. They hate the Druge. The only reason they are fighting for them is to try and keep their people safe. If the Empire threatens the safety of the Black Wind Sept in the Barrens, they will have absolutely no choice but to surrender. The Black Wind army, the Druge army that carries that name and has engaged in one merciless attack after another on Imperial forces, will collapse. In theory, it might even be possible to force the Black Wind to fight for the Empire, given that is exactly what the Druge have done. It would require a constant threat of bloody reprisals against their people if they did not fight. A potentially more palatable alternative, the military council could send Imperial armies to force the Black Wind to flee the Barrens. It would require a massive force to move them on, otherwise their people will scatter and hide, but if 5 Imperial armies are given clear orders to drive the Black Wind Sept out of the Barrens, then they will be forcibly evicted from their homes. They will be forced to leave most of their belongings behind, which will create an opportunity for spoils of war the following season. The Sept will flee east into the Malum. Any action in this vein would damage the Empire's standing with the Ravin, the Montanians, and the Great Forest Orcs. Although the Black Wind no longer speak of their former comrades in arms, they are widely viewed as former allies rather than enemies by their fellow rebels. There is clear evidence that the Druge have been adept at maximising the propaganda benefits of actions of this kind by the Empire in the past. Black Wind risks. The presence of the Black Wind in the Barrens is a clear risk to the safety of every Imperial citizen. The Black Wind want to see the Empire destroyed, Dawnguard ruined, and every Imperial citizen in the Barrens eaten alive by ravenous marsh lizards. They are sullen and filled with hatred of the Empire, who they regard as more loathsome versions of the Druge. They enthusiastically supported Sarah Grubfest against the Dornish people of Dawnguard, and will eagerly seize any opportunity to harm the Empire. Their continued presence is a constant risk to every Imperial citizen in the Barrens. Dorn. Who are the Dornish? A very good question. The Dornish are Imperial citizens whose noble houses have lived in the Barrens for centuries. The majority live in Dawnguard, but there are Dornish living in Murderdale, the Carmine Fields, and a few who live in Hope's Rest and Bitterstrand. The Dornish have held Dawnguard for centuries, a foothold in the Barrens that have never wavered. From there they have sought to conquer the territory, with waves of Dornish settlers expanding into Murderdale, the Carmine Fields, and beyond. Several prominent noble houses have been based there, although some fled the region when it was conquered by the Druge. Imperial law is clear that these people are Imperial citizens, even those who still toil under the rule of the Druge. They are Dornish citizens just as the people of Semerholm, Astolat and Weirwater are. They are deeply proud of their nation, delighted by the military and political victories they have achieved. They have fought to make the Barrens part of Dorne for hundreds of years, and are elated by their triumphant victory. They're excited to see the Druge finally driven out, and the regions of Murderdale and the heart of Paytat liberated from their control. They are aware that their neighbours do not share their triumph, but the prevailing attitude is one of, "We won a glorious victory, now it's time for troubadours and advocates." The Dornish National Assembly have made it clear that their knights and witches were here to liberate the Barrens and free the Orcs. Most of the people of Dawnguard are entirely behind that idea. As long as they have Dawnguard, and probably Carmine Fields and Murderdale, so they will have somewhere to farm and expand into, and the Plains of Teeth, so that they control the fortress where the Hounds of Gory paid the ultimate, glorious price for victory, they see no problem in allowing them to keep chunks of the wilderness, if that's what they want. Wild places and unfamiliar septs both mean more opportunity for adventure and glory. The question of glory comes up many times. The Barrens is a wild land full of mysteries and excitement and dangerous places, and the Dornish of Dawnguard like it that way. They point to the Truelow consecration at the Well of Hope as a reminder that the quest for glory never ends. What does Dawnguard want? They want the Towers of Dawn rebuilt to match the strength of the Spires of Dusk. They want the Druge driven out of the Barrens and the eastern borders secured. They want the political future of the Barrens as a Dornish territory secured. They want the Fangs and the Eaves of Paytat to be made Dornish boar seats. They want to see the Empire destroy the Druge. Having defeated the Druge, the Dornish want the political and military future of the Barrens to be secured. The physical embodiment of this would be rebuilding the Towers of the Dawn in Dawnguard. The great fortification was overrun by the Druge when it was finally conquered the entire Barrens, and its destruction presaged a grim period for the Dornish who suffered under Druge rule. In the minds of many, the safety of Dawnguard and the Barrens is physically contingent on the construction of a new fortification. For that reason, they want a new fortification to be constructed, at least as big as the Spires of Dusk, if not bigger. That will help ensure that the people feel confident that the Druge cannot retake Dawnguard anytime soon. Both Adamant and Cathan Cannae have expressed interest in helping realise this goal. At present, the Druge still control the Carmine Fields and the Heart of Patat. The Dornish want to see these regions conquered and quickly to prevent the Druge using them to unleash curses and other terrors on the Barrens, and to make it harder for the Druge to return. The Steel Causeway split the regions from the Druge supply lines, but they still represent a major threat to the safety of the territory. The Dornish want to see that threat dealt with. They also want to see the eastern borders of the territory secured. There are a mix of views of the Cuirass. The Dornish don't know them at all, but what they hear from the other septs does not fill them with confidence. If these allies of the Druge hold the Bleaks and the Plains of Teeth, it will allow the Druge to march into the Barrens unopposed. Either the Cuirass need to be dealt with, or else the Empire need to establish a new border with the Druge, one that exists beyond the Barrens, by invading Sarengrave and the Salt Flats. They also want the political Barrens of the future as a Dornish territory secure. Now that the war's won, they want to make peace with their neighbours, but they are aware of the many competing expectations and demands of the other septs. They don't uniformly oppose those demands. They accept that some land may need to be ceded to ensure a lasting peace. However, they do not want to give up any land that they view as fundamentally Dornish by rights of conquest, notably Dawnguard, Murderdale, the Carmine Fields, and the Plains of Teeth. Crucially, they will not accept any outcome that means so much land is ceded that the Barrens ceases to be a Dornish territory. Many Yo-folk are interested in the possibility of trade, but they understand that might take time. Whatever else happens, they want to be sure that they'll be able to explore and quest in the Barrens freely, no matter who controls which parts of it. They especially want to be sure that they can visit the chapel at Hope's Rest, which now serves as a memorial to everyone who died to free the Barrens. There's some discussion about the Fangs and the Eaves of Patat, the Weirwood Grove at the heart of Patat. They would like both Bourse resources to be made Dornish seats, pointing out that Dorne is the only nation in the entire Empire that has no proper Bourse seat. They are aware that the Eaves of Patat has been promised to the Great Forest Orcs, and cynical voices suggest that the Fangs will end up as an Imperial seat once the Raven are kicked out, so hopes are not high of getting both seats. Finally, they want to see the armies of Dorne spearhead the campaigns against the Druge in the Salt Flats of Senath, the Forest of Ornac, and the Sarengrave. They want the Druge consigned to dusty archives, their name ultimately known only to scholars and troubadours. The phrase, "death to the Druge," still echoes around the Barrens. It is one of the few things that almost everyone agrees on. Dornish risks. Any future for the Barrens, other than a Dornish territory of the Empire, will outrage the people of Dorne. Now that the Senate has allocated the Barrens to Dorne, the view of most Dornish people is that the greatest quest in history has now been completed. Dorne's triumph is glorious beyond compare, and not just for Dorne, but the whole Empire. There is a limitless sense of celebration with completion of a dream that has occupied the hearts of Dorne for 5 centuries. Any political resolution that fundamentally changes the status of the Barrens as a Dornish territory of the Empire will see that joy turn to fury. Participation. This section above refers to the non-player character nobles and Yo-folk of the Barrens and Dorne. While characters who attend Anvil summits are the most influential people in the nation, the folk of the nation often have their own opinions on weighty matters that affect them. There's absolutely no requirement for a Dornish player character, whichever territory they are from, to agree with all or even any of these positions. You're encouraged to make up your own minds. It isn't off-brief to disagree with these attitudes. At the same time, it is also not off-brief to embrace some or all of them. If you want to be a populist hero of the people, for example, then championing these positions is one way to do so. The only thing to bear in mind is that this section represents the attitude of the Dornish as a faction in the Barrens, beliefs every bit as political and challenging as those of the other septs identified above. They might be negotiated with using tools such as the Synod or the Senate, but they can't simply be told to believe something else. The Druge. The Druge still retain control of the Heart of Patat and Murderdale. They are using these regions to launch attacks on the Barrens. Whilst the Septs are somewhat encouraged by the Empire having driven off the Druge, especially given the army's focus on liberation, they are still concerned that the Empire has left the territory relatively undefended while the Druge maintain control of these 2 regions. Their armies have fled, but there are still more than enough Druge there to cause problems for the Imperials in Dawnguard, as well as the other septs. Only last season the late Knight Protector of Winter, Aranel Mortier, was tasked with stopping Varag's Soulflare from unleashing winter spirits throughout the territory. It is clear that these kinds of attacks will continue for as long as the Druge have some foothold in the territory. With their current holdings they could theoretically reach Brokeliand or Summerholm. The Druge have a well-earned reputation for spitefulness. When the Sandfishers were granted sanctuary in Holberg, the Druge sent armies to invade the most well-defended territory in the Eastern Empire, just for a chance to punish them and terrify anyone who might resist their rule. They were defeated, but it was a sobering reminder of who the Druge are. They tore down the Tower of the Scorpion rather than let the Empire have it. They almost destroyed the Great Pits of Enneland and the Vigilant Swan, and few Highborn will forget the horrors they inflicted on Rykos when they were driven out. During the final season of fighting in the Barrens, the Tainted Basilisk unleashed a barrage of curses and maledictions against the territory, some of which are still in effect. For almost everyone in the Barrens, it is not a matter of if the Druge will return, but when. Many of the septs are deeply fearful for their fate when that happens, believing the Druge will exact terrible retribution if they collaborate with the Empire now. Cathan Canai. Cathan Canai has been clear in the past that she would consider the Empire ceding more land to their enemies to be sufficient to break the assurance on Frozen Citadel of Cathan Canai. There is room to negotiate with the Eternal if the Empire wishes to cede lands in the Barrens. The Imperial Synod could denounce the way in which Cathan Canai is dictating how the Empire behaves. There is one final fly in the ointment, which Dornish enchanters are particularly aware of. The Summer Eternal Cathan Canai has made it clear that in the past she is concerned about the Empire's willingness to trade away their land to their enemies, or their supposed allies in return for aid against their enemies. All of this talk of concedence is likely to attract the attention of the Queen of Ice and Darkness. However, after a great deal of discussion, some of its heralds of the immutable object herself, they believe there is room for negotiation. What the Mistress of Blizzards will not accept is the Empire giving up land to its enemies in return for peace. But the Empire could make the case that this is not what is being discussed, given that they have been clear all along that their intent was to liberate the Barrens Orcs, not conquer the Barrens. Any concessions to the Sept could be presented as rewards to a potential ally in return for their support. It is not clear what the best argument might be, but the Enchanters of Dawn are confident that ceding lands to the people of the Empire has liberated will not automatically incur the ire of the Mistress of Blizzards. It would, however, be unwise to cede lands and then keep casting Frozen Citadel without discussing the matter with the immovable one first. But the Archmage of Summer could use their power of plenipotentiary to discuss the matter with either the Eternal herself or her lieutenants and see what kind of agreement can be reached. When the matter is discussed, some Highborn Magisters are strongly of the opinion that it is deeply inappropriate for the Lady of Frost or any Eternal to dictate Imperial policy in this way. There is more than the faintest hint of idolatry about this entire business, and perhaps it might be best for the Empire to stop relying on the gifts of an Eternal who would attempt such obvious blackmail. They call on the Imperial Synod to take a stance on this matter. Menthratat. The Menthratat of Ossium want the Empire to cede Farweald to them. In return, they will share their single dose of Black Lotus with the Empire. Only the Karass would welcome the Menthratat's return in the Barrens. It would be universally opposed by all other factions. There is one final faction with an interest in the Barrens, the Sept of the Menthratat in Ossium, have let it be known that in return for the Empire ceding them their ancestral lands in Farweald, they will share their greatest treasure, a single dose of Black Lotus, and their knowledge on what can be done with it. The Dornish, the Ravin, the Great Forest Orcs, the Vendari, and the Montanians all express significant reservations about them returning to the Barrens. Apart from the Karass, whose dark reputation they share, everyone is opposed from them claiming Farweald as their own.